Okay, hello everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Rachel Wesson. I'm the Events and Communications Specialist at the UC Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. And it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to our discussion today, where we are taking a closer look at privacy and the future of the ad-supported internet with Steve Satterfield, who is the Director of Privacy and Public Policy at Facebook. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's discussion, another Steve, Professor Steve Weber. In addition to serving as the faculty director for the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, Steve is a professor at both the UC Berkeley School of Information as well as the Department of Political Science. So with that, Steve, I will pass it over to you.
Rachel. First of all, let me add my thanks for everyone to be here today, in particular Steve Satterfield, who I'm going to introduce in just a moment. Before we get started, I want to add a quick reminder about a point about CLTC's funding sources, just so this is on the table. At CLTC, we receive support from a variety of private companies, along with foundations and individuals. And we accept that support primarily in the form of unrestricted gifts, which come with no conditions and no specific products and no deliverables. So we have received unrestricted gifts from Facebook in the past that we use to support a variety of our research and outreach programs. Facebook is one of many companies that have supported us in this way. And you can see a full list of those firms. They're on our website, as well as a fuller statement of our fundraising policies that are right there. I say this because we work on timely and sometimes highly controversial issues around digital security, digital privacy. So we feel it's critical to not only abide by the university rules that ensure intellectual and research independence, but to always double down on transparency and clarity, which is why I'm just saying this today. Okay, with that out of the way, let me introduce Steve Satterfield, who has been gracious enough to join us today from what is undoubtedly a busy day in his world at Facebook. Steve is the director of public policy or one of senior directors of public policy at Facebook. He leads a team that's responsible for developing and advocating for Facebook perspectives on privacy and data-related regulation. I know he's got a huge portfolio, and I hope you'll tell us a little bit about it, Steve. I will mention that before joining Facebook in 2014, which I guess makes you a lifer, right? Steve was a privacy lawyer at Covington and Burley in Washington, D.C. So, Steve, before we get started on the substance, could you just tell us a little bit about your background, your current role, what you do when you get up in the morning, and what drew you into this so interesting and crazy job?
Yeah, well, it's a real pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity. So yeah, I've been at Facebook for 7 years, or almost 7 years, which is an eternity. The company's been around, I think, for 17. And when I joined, there were maybe 5,000 employees, and now I think we're more than 60,000. And so it's been an interesting thing to watch this company grow and develop. And I'm sure we're going to talk about that as the conversation evolves. But before I came to Facebook, as you mentioned, I was a privacy lawyer at Covington and Burley. So I'm a lawyer by training. I got interested in privacy in law school. I didn't realize that this had happened. I mean, I just was sort of gravitating toward these courses that were largely courses about criminal procedure, national security law, and then I did take an information privacy law class. It just happened that I went to school at George Washington University Law School. We had this tremendous faculty of privacy and technology law scholars. And Dan Solov is the one that people have probably heard of and it comes to mind, but Oren Kerr was still at GW at that point. Jeffrey Rosen, who I now know is the legal affairs editor of the New Republic. I had all of these guys when I was studying in law school, and I was lucky enough to go to Covington, which was one of the few firms at that point. Man, I sound like I'm an old guy. One of the few firms at that point that had a really a robust and developed privacy and data protection practice. And so I started working with technology and media companies, including Facebook, when I was a lawyer there, and I was lucky enough to join Facebook's team a couple of years 4 or 5 years after that. For most of my time at Facebook, I've actually worked on public policy issues that relate to advertising. So that's why the topic, I think, is what it is. My data regulation team is a new team. What does my day look like? It's never the same. This is a really exciting place to work. But I work a lot on privacy legislation. There's been an explosion in privacy legislation around the world, and my team is a global team. And so we work a lot on that, but we are also sort of deeply involved in processes inside and outside the company when it comes to implementing new laws. We don't just work on proposed laws. And as I said, I still wear one of the sort of ads hat. One of my hats is an ads hat, and so I still work on some of our ads related issues. But anyway, I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Okay, that's great. So let's start just by setting the groundwork and making sure that we know what we're all talking about. Because as we were saying earlier, what was abstract for really maybe the last 10 months has suddenly this week become very real, as we've all updated our iPhones, or those of us who have iPhones have updated them to iOS 14.5. And we discover the first time we open an app, we get a simple question: allow the app to track your activity across other companies' apps and websites, or not allow to do. An app developer gets a tiny bit of space to make the case for why one outcome rather than another, one choice rather than another. Ask app not to track is on top, so it looks like the default choice to many people. And I think the consensus is, we don't have the data yet about what people are actually doing, but the consensus is that most users are expected most of the time to choose that option. In other words, ask app not to track. What's being tracked if you allow it? This thing called the IDFA, which only software geeks knew about until this week. Now everybody knows about the ID for advertisers, this unique number that identifies your iPhone, that can identify a similar number across apps and web pages, and connect that number in one place to what you do in other places in order to build some kind of a profile or do other things with data. So we'll talk about what it does. If you say no, you'll see less ads. Excuse me, you won't see less ads like you do on a browser, but presumably they'll be less personalized to you and less valuable to the advertiser as a result. So this is the basic reason, I think, just intuitively, why many ad industry firms, data compilers, data brokers, and there are many of those, of course, aren't happy about it. Many app developers might not be happy about it, since their business model depends in part on the advertising revenue that they receive as a result of what they do on their apps. It sounds really simple in one respect. Ask users what they want and give it to them. And so that is part of the story. But I think as we want to get into, it's absolutely not that simple. So I think what we want to talk about today is really, how can we expose some of the complexities, figure out what's at stake, and look for constructive solutions that can, as we like to say at CLTC, amplify the upside and de-risk the downsides of this dynamic that's going on. And the last thing I want to say before I pose a question to you, Steve, to get us started is this. I think, for those of us who follow this in the media, it's easy and often to portray this as a battle between Facebook and Apple, or even in some cases between like two individuals, Mark Zuckerberg and Tim Cook. And I think we should acknowledge there's some of that, a little bit of that is going on, but it's much bigger than that. And in fact, it might just be about one of the really most fundamental elements of visions of what the internet is and how it should work. So from my perspective, that's what the stakes are all about. Please take issue with anything of what I've just said, but let's start with the specifics and then we'll go more general. From your perspective, what is the problem that Apple is trying to solve here? And what do you think makes sense about their way of solving it? And what do you think does not make sense about their way of solving it?
Yeah, great. And I mean, I agree with the setup. I mean, I think there are a couple of things that are probably worth expanding on. And so what problem are they trying to solve? Well, let's talk about what the policy is. This starts with a policy. It was announced almost a year ago. It's a policy that they call the App Tracking Transparency Policy. And it is the reason why we all know what the IDFA is now. But it's not just about that. So it does two things. The first part of the policy requires app developers, developers that make their apps available in the Apple App Store, to get permission through one of those gray system prompts to access the IDFA, which is, as you say, it's an identifier that is stored on the phone, right? And what it does is it sort of plays the same role that cookies play on a web, but it plays that role on apps. And it's primarily there to help advertisers target ads, that is, select the audience for an ad and measure the effectiveness of those ads. That's the IDFA. But that's not the only part of the policy. That's the part of the policy I think that's intuitive to a lot of people. Okay, Apple is now requiring developers to get permission to access that identifier. That's not the only thing, though. There's also a part of the policy that restricts an app developer's ability to use data basically from any other source outside of the app to show people personalized ads within the app. Mm-hmm. Okay, and there's a sort of like there's a corollary to that, which is that if you're an advertiser and you want to send data to another app to show your ads in that app, you've got to get permission for that too. So you got to get permission all over the place. And so maybe we should try to make this concrete. What does this actually look like? I had this experience, as we were discussing, Steve, right before the call. Like a lot of people, I now order wine, through an app on my phone. It's been a hard year. I get one of these app tracking transparency prompts. I get a gray system prompt, and it says that this wine store wants to track me across different apps and websites. I'm like, wait, I'm sorry, what? So my wine store is going to be following me around to different apps? No, that's not what's going on there. What's going on there is that this wine store wants to send data about, maybe my purchases, my interests, who I am, to an ad platform to show me ads somewhere else. Mm-hmm. Because of the way that Apple is defining tracking, which is not really intuitive, this advertiser, this is the role that the wine store is playing. This advertiser's got to get permission from me. What's interesting is wherever they're running their ads, that's on, maybe that's on Facebook, maybe that's on Google, maybe that's on some other ad platform. That ad platform's got to get permission too. They've got to get permission to use that data. And so there's a kind of a double permission requirement that's happening here, right? And by the way, I should add that it doesn't matter if the wine store has previously gotten permission to do this, or if the ad platform's previously gotten permission to do this. It's sort of all wiped out by the new policy. Now, you're right, Steve, this introduces a ton of friction, right? And the way that the choice is presented, I don't think anybody would call this a neutral choice. There is certainly a thumb on the scale that Apple is pushing. It's pushing people to say no. It's pushing people to say no, which is going to make it harder for that advertiser to advertise, right? Personalized advertising is extremely valuable, especially to these smaller ones, and this wine store is a smaller business. And it's going to make it harder for the developer, where the ads are showing up. It's going to make the developers, it's going to make it harder for that developer to make money through advertising, to monetize through ads. So this is a big deal. This is why that's why there's so much conversation about this. There's been a lot of reaction from the ads industry. There's been a lot of reaction from developers, because it's going to make the business model of the internet a little harder to operate.
So, Steve, there's a lot to unpack there, but there's the piece of it I want to zero in on for the moment is, what is the problem that Apple is trying to? So, if in fact, your reaction to that question from Total Wine and More, they're not tracking me across other websites. Other people's reactions might be really different. Like maybe they are. How do I know? What is the problem that Apple is trying to solve here? And maybe more interestingly, from your perspective, sitting at Facebook, if there is a real problem out there, whether it be lack of consent, lack of understanding, the relationship between those two things, how would you folks think about solving that problem more effectively?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, what problem are they trying to solve? I think that what they say is that they're trying to bring greater transparency and control to the ways in which data is used for online advertising, which, by the way, is a perfectly laudable goal, right? I don't think anybody has a quarrel with what they're ostensibly trying to accomplish. I think that people do have a quarrel about how they're going about doing it, which again is thumb on the scale, right? Thumb on the scale. I think there's been a little bit of downplaying of their own business interests as well. Like a world in which it's harder to monetize through ads is a world in which developers have to use other means to monetize, subscriptions and in-app payments. Apple takes a cut of those subscriptions and in-app payments, which is a separate controversy you're hearing play out in the litigation with the Epic games. They do have a business interest in a world in which personalized advertising becomes harder. And they are also, you may have seen yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, in fact, they're also simultaneously trying to build their own business. Yeah. And it just so happens that their own products, their own advertising products work a little better than third-party advertising products in this new world. And we can get into that. But what's the alternative, I think, is your question. Yeah. So I think it's great to focus on this. So I think it's a couple of things. One is that what we should be doing, I think, and what Facebook thinks, is that we should be trying not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? There is the ad-supported internet is the internet as we know it, and there's value in trying to preserve the business model that gave us the internet. And there are real consequences to moving to a different business model. So how do we do that? Well, I'll give you a couple of examples. One is a tool that we released, I guess it's been almost 2 years now, that actually is in the same ballpark, has some of the same goals as the Apple policy. It's called Off Facebook Activity. And what this is a tool that a user can go and see a summary of the data that advertisers are sending to Facebook through our business tools. That's the code that the advertiser builds into its apps and websites that sends us data for ad targeting and for measurement. You can see a summary. You can see, like, if I visited the wine store, right? You can see that the wine store sent data to Facebook. You can see it, and you can disconnect it from your account. So you can say, I don't want that information stored with my account. If I have a profile, I don't want that information stored with my profile. And you can make that choice on a going forward basis too. So I don't want any of these third parties that are using Facebook's business tool. I don't want any of that information connected to my account. And the point of doing this was to try to have a better transparency and control, but in a way that preserves the benefits while trying to address some of the concerns. Because even in this scenario, there is a join that happens between that information that comes from the third party and Facebook, such that we can measure the effectiveness of the advertising on Facebook. There's a temporary join, and then that information gets disconnected if the person wants to disconnect it. And so we preserve some of the benefit. Obviously, we can't use that information to target the person with advertising, but we do get some of that measurement, and that is an incredibly valuable piece of the service. I mean, maybe it's even more valuable than the targeting. It's sometimes hard to tell. Knowing that your advertising is working or not working is incredibly valuable especially for businesses with small budgets. If I'm wasting my money, I need to know this. So it was a solution that tried to do both, privacy protection and sustaining at least part of the benefits of this kind of data flow that supports the ads ecosystem.
Let me dig on that point a little bit, because it's a super interesting one. I want to come back a little bit later to upframe the privacy conversation a little bit, but for the moment, stick on this point, and maybe I'll just build on the baby bathwater analogy with the question of, like, what exactly is the baby? You said that the goal is to preserve the model that gave us the internet. One view, I'm old enough to remember the internet as a place that was supposed to be an ecosystem of lots and lots and lots of small innovative companies that could grow up really, really quickly. I mean, I think that I remember there was something about the Cambrian explosion or something like this back in the early 90s. There are many people who feel that the internet isn't that, like the internet we have today is not that internet. So, and Facebook has made the argument that the preferential treatment, or let me turn it the opposite way, disadvantaging small businesses is a really bad thing, and damages the kind of internet we want to have. So in other words, the baby. Talk about, from your perspective, how small business voice is best articulated and how small business interests are best respected in this.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's two things. I think there are two babies, right? I mean, there is, when I talk about preserving the internet as we know it, I mean, I think that the internet is still characterized by access to incredible amounts of information for free. Like if you had told me in the 1970s, and I mean, I was an English major, I wasn't really a tech guy, but if you told me in the 1970s, I wasn't around in the 1970s either, but bear with me on this hypothetical, that there would one day be a service where I could enter in search terms and have access to basically all of the world's recorded knowledge within, less than seconds, I would never have believed you. But even if you had told me that this thing would become a reality, I would have assumed that it would only be available to the wealthiest members of society. And of course, that's not true. This is, the power of search is just an incredible thing. And I just don't know how we can deny that. And search has been brought to us by advertising. I think the same thing is true of the Facebook social network. That we connect 3 billion people around the world, without asking people to pay for that, whether that's through WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook, and increasingly our virtual reality products. This is advertising. Advertising has brought us these services. So I think that that's one. And it's kind of an astonishing thing to me how quickly we tend to discount that. Even the news media. And I know that a number of them are very critical of the business model, that the ad-supported business model. Although we should talk about the complaint that was filed with the German antitrust authorities the other day about Apple's new policy. But even those folks, even the ones that are the big media players, they still are largely supported through advertising. So I don't think we should undervalue access to free content or subsidized access. But the small business point, and I'm so glad that you're raising this, because I do feel like initially some of our messaging about the impact of small businesses wasn't well understood. What is Facebook talking about small businesses? The bottom line is this: small businesses rely disproportionately on personalized advertising. Right? They rely disproportionately on personalized advertising. And when you have a policy or a new product that is going to affect personalized advertising, it's going to have a disproportionate impact on them. And the reason for that is simple, actually. It's that small businesses have limited advertising budgets, and they can't afford to waste money. They can't afford to waste advertising impressions. So I'm a big business. I can slap an ad up on a billboard, and hundreds of thousands of people could drive by on the 101 and maybe not even look at it. But maybe 1 out of 100,000 people even looks up on the morning commute. And a small fraction of that is even going to sort of remember, or even smaller, to take action on that. Right? Small businesses can't afford that kind of waste. And that is the technical industry term. They can't afford that kind of waste. They have to start with a smaller group, right, of people who are already likely to be interested in what they're offering. And that's what personalized advertising brings. It brings that initially smaller group. So I'm already talking to somebody who may be interested in the product or service I'm offering. So I think that's really the small business piece.
Okay, so I want to upframe. I want to take us out of the weeds for a little bit and talk about a general discussion about privacy in this regard. Because look, I mean, this is in some sense, it's a great moment, right? Because now privacy is on everyone's minds in a really concrete way. They're experiencing a different set of choices and relationships to it. For those of us who kind of, skirt around and work in issues that are connected to the privacy debate, it often feels like it's a bunch of people sort of like screaming at each other to see who can scream the loudest. from my perspective, I feel like the academic literature is stuck in some respects. We were talking earlier about sort of the disconnect between the way policymakers are trying to parse this question, the ongoing constant conversation of will there be a federal privacy regulation this year or will there not be? And the academics and the policymakers are a little bit disconnected. And look, let's be honest, Facebook is often portrayed as the villain in this discussion. So I want to sort of put it to you in this respect, at least you're at the center of, certainly you're at the center of the storm. So I want to know from your perspective, what does the storm look like? How can you sort of see the company taking a leadership role that would move the ball forward in a way that helps your users and your customers and your consumers? And most importantly, Steve, kind of reflect a little bit, if you can, on this issue about, look, I mean, big businesses will always use regulatory levers to try to advantage themselves where they can. That's just, in some sense, normal blocking and tackling. I'm not saying it's ethically good. I'm just saying it's the way capitalism in democracies tends to work. Apple will do it. You guys will do it. Google will do it. Everybody will do it. How do we as consumers, how do we make that a better situation where we're not sort of just being buffeted between those different interests?
Yeah, well, let me see if I can take those one at a time. I mean, you asked, what's it like to be at the center of the storm? I think the better metaphor is like a fast-flowing river, right? And that's what it feels like. A fast-flowing river of criticism. Look, and much warranted. I mean, you mentioned the kind of the heated nature of the debate. I mean, these are crucial issues. Of course, there's a lot of emotion around them. I would be surprised if there weren't. So there's a fast flowing river of criticism, but also proposals, right? I mean, we've actually moved a lot, especially in the last couple of years, to where we're now trying to address these things largely through regulation. And like, what are we trying to do? I mean, I think that, what do I do when I get up in the morning? I think that I'm trying to inject facts and evidence into the policy debate. I think that a lot of times the policy debate gets overheated. I think a lot of times the facts are kind of missing, and that's really on us. Like, it's our job to provide the evidence that's appropriate for consideration in policymaking processes. So I think that's kind of what we're looking at. I think your ultimate question was, what does this mean for consumers? Or where is Facebook leading? Or where could Facebook lead? I mean, it's a great question, and I know there's plenty of skepticism by Facebook leadership on privacy. Right? I hear that, but I think you should look at the products. And I think I'm very proud of the work that we've done on what privacy folks call user data rights. Right. User data rights are traditionally access, correction, deletion, portability. And we've made a lot of progress on these fronts. We have an updated access to your information tool, which I encourage people to have a look at. Right. Very easy to understand the kinds of information that Facebook has about you. And if you want to, delete that information. And we've made a lot of positive progress on deletion as well. We have a new tool called Manage Activity, which is like a way to bulk archive or even delete content that you've previously shared on Facebook. And the last one I'd mentioned is portability, which is one that I work on all the time. It's sort of near and dear to my heart. We've, through a partnership with the Data Transfer Project, which is a group of tech companies that are trying to build interoperable data transmission APIs. We have a new product called Transfer Your Information, which is enabling you to directly transfer your increasing numbers of types of data to increasing numbers of partners. And we had an announcement on that just recently. So these are the things that I'm proud of, and I would hope that for what consumers have, what's in it for consumers is innovation around sort of privacy protective technologies like those. I hope that's what's being incentivized by the regulation.
Yeah, so I want to push that point because from my perspective, sometimes looking at it from the outside, I would say the system is broken. It's broken in different ways for different companies and different stakeholders. Nobody really understands the stakes of what they do on the internet in a profound way. So like one way to make progress on that is in fact what you just ended with, which is, can we have a constructive competition where basically firms like yours and others are competing on privacy in a constructive way, as well as, beating up on each other, which we just expect is going to be part of the game, right? It's just the nature of the game. What could regulators do from your perspective to try to create a more vibrant kind of race to the top?
Yeah, well, I think it's a couple of things. One is we're going to see how this plays out. In the complaints that are arising out of new sort of privacy products. I mean, there are now complaints in France and Germany against Apple arising out of the iOS 14 stuff that we're talking about. And so we'll see if there's greater antitrust enforcement around, sort of putative privacy measures that may be carried out through anti-competitive means.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's one thing. But the second thing is, which is probably a dissatisfying answer to your question, but it's maybe as much a question as it is anything else. But it's basically, how do we incentivize innovation around privacy?
Yeah.
Right. I'm afraid that I only have like a negative answer to that, because I think that the market incentives, I think, do exist. I think we're seeing that. I think that no one would agree with that more than Apple.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm seeing, ads on the sides of buildings promoting privacy and Apple products. I mean, they're the greatest marketers in the history of the world, right? I mean, they're probably onto something.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that the incentives are there, but I think it's more, how do we avoid sort of creating, or how do we create the right incentives? I think what sometimes we see, or we're seeing more of in regulation, which is not helpful when it comes to innovating around privacy, is extremely prescriptive, or prescriptions around designing products. Mm-hmm. I can give you a couple of examples. You see in the e-privacy regulation, which has been percolating in Europe for 4 years now, there's very prescriptive language around the ways in which you would get consent to use cookies and device IDs, which is an interesting thing, but it's extremely prescriptive. I think that stuff becomes ossified pretty quickly. And I think it discourages the kind of creative solutions to very legitimate concerns about privacy and data collection online.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I mean, this may be a facile analogy, but for the conversation we had earlier about how valuable it is to understand, did an advertisement achieve what it was supposed to achieve? I'd love to sort of think about that same standard of proof for privacy actions and privacy policies. Is it achieving what it was supposed to achieve? Because probably, maybe the anecdotal way of saying it might be 50% of privacy actions do what they're supposed to do, but we don't know which 50%.
Boy, that's fascinating. I mean, metrics for regulation generally, I think are a pretty interesting thing, and measuring the impact of privacy is fascinating, because of course the conventional wisdom is embodied in the privacy paradox that that people don't actually care, right? That we build all of these choice infrastructures and they don't actually care. I don't know what to say about that conventional wisdom. I do think, though, Steve, to an earlier point that you were making, policymaking may be trending in a difficult direction when it comes to giving people a bigger stake in managing their information online. And so it is very much moving in the direction in which Apple is moving, which is a reliance on consent, right? Just ask people's permission. What could be wrong with asking people's permission? Let's just ask them their permission for everything. But the experience ramifications of that are pretty significant, to the point where we are flooded with requests for permission, constantly, to the point where we tune out and we actually stop paying attention and stop managing our data. I mean, this is where the academic commentary is actually really strong, and you're seeing very prominent privacy scholars, none of whom many of whom are not lovers of Facebook, right? They are critics of ours, who are increasingly skeptical about this way of protecting privacy, which is just give people's permission, And you're hearing policymakers say the opposite thing, which is that this should be the gold standard of the way that we protect privacy online.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I do think the academic community is trying to connect these objectives together. For example, what we know about choice fatigue, what we know about, what informed actually means, and so on and so forth. It's quite challenging, but what we want to do is kind of keep moving that discussion forward rather than getting stuck in these kind of personalized fights, which I think are, probably not helpful to anyone. So that's why, we wanted to have this conversation with you. Let me end with one sort of slightly more abstract question, and then let's see what people are wanting to talk about. We'll do some question and answers. And it's sort of an upframe, Steve, and it really goes away from the question of privacy to something that personally I think is even more fundamental, which is the question of trust. And the trust deficit that exists not only, many times is sort of like nailed to Facebook's wall, but it's not only about Facebook, it's about many technology companies. And what sometimes I think I forget and others forget is the engineering kind of legacy of a company like Facebook, and frankly, many other companies that have been hit with this trust deficit as well. It was just really brought home for me a couple of weeks ago. I mentioned this to you, I think earlier. I was listening to your CEO's talking about VR and AR on the 411 podcast. And when he testifies before Congress, it's not the most fun thing to watch. Listening to him talk about the technology was a completely different experience. I mean, he was totally geeking out. And I'm like, that's actually, we want more of that, actually. But in order to get more of that, you guys and your competitors and your compatriots need a higher level of trust from both your customers and from government. The days of permissionless innovation are well past us. Everybody is trying to figure out what is a kind of a pathway of responsible innovation. You need the social license to operate. I personally am of the view that we need companies with excellent engineering talent to have a legitimate and appropriate social license to experiment, because we need more technology in our lives managed appropriately, not less. So if you have a deficit in your trust account, and I don't even mean this explicitly about Facebook per se, let's make it about the industry as a whole, okay? If there's a deficit in the trust account, what can companies like yours and your competitors do to build up some more credit in that account so that you can do the kinds of experiments that actually in the long run are going to make this industry vibrant?
Yeah, wow. Huge questions. I think that there's one thing that's completely unglamorous, and there's one thing that is probably more interesting. The unglamorous stuff is stuff like governance, right? I mean, this is the thing, is one of the ways in which I've seen this company grow in the 7 years I've been here is the implementation of governance structures. And this is not an exciting thing. It is an essential thing, right? I mean, I work on privacy. I can give you privacy examples. We now have a privacy committee of the board, right? Which is driving real change in the way that we approach privacy. We have executive level accountability for the decisions that we make around privacy and the implementation of our privacy program. We've made mistakes in the past. Part of the way that we recover from those mistakes is surely by kind of doing the unglamorous governance work of managing our decision-making and risk assessment around privacy better. And so that's the unglamorous thing. The other thing, which I think is probably more generally applicable to your question, Steve, is transparency. Mm-hmm. I think that there's still a lot of misunderstanding about what's actually going on Facebook. What do people see when they go on Facebook? Unfortunately, I think a lot of we only have anecdotal reporting based on our own experiences, right? I mean, what else would there be? Well, we're trying to build more transparency around what are people experiencing on Facebook. I thought one of the best things we did last year, which didn't get a lot of coverage, was it was an election year. People were talking about political content. They've been talking about political content for a while, to the point where you might assume that when you open up the Facebook app, what you're seeing is just a stream of political content. But what are people actually seen. And it turns out that when we looked at this, it's probably about 6%. It was about 6% of the content in your feed was political content. And that was in the US in 2020. I think we need more of that. And it can't all come from Facebook, right? We need to be opening up more data to researchers, to the academic community that's going to hold us to account. We can't do that while compromising privacy. There's a whole other conversation, but it is something that we're committed to. And we've done some pretty interesting things around. We released the ad targeting data for the ads, the political ads running up to the 2020 US election to researchers who were part of the Facebook Open Research and Transparency Program. Mm-hmm. That's going to yield some fascinating research, I'm sure. But I think it's the transparency that is going to help build the trust that you're talking about.
Okay, great. So we're getting a couple of interesting questions. I mean, listen, this is the biggest conversation one could have in the contemporary era, but there's some specific questions. I want to pose a couple of them in a kind of a coagulated way, Steve, if that's okay. One of them is sort of pointing to, a question that has been asked many times in many different settings, which is about the value of the user's data and how best to kind of, honestly reflect that back to the user. So one argument would be, look, and we've all heard this argument that users value seeing relevant as compared to random advertising. I think that that's not the most compelling argument. There's an economic logic to it, but it kind of doesn't resonate very strongly with people's guts. So what resonates more strongly for many people, not everyone, is the idea that, hey, if my data has value, I ought to be able to find some way to monetize that value and take a piece of that back in money. So this is around, the arguments that we've heard really for a number of years now about pay for data, data collectives, the work of people like Jaron Lanier and Glenn Weil. How does that sit from your perspective with the notion of the ad-supported internet and free services?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question. It's a question that's being debated in DC, in Brussels, and in legislatures around the world right now. I mean, what I hear in that question is a concern that I think we hear a lot, which is that are people getting fair value in exchange for whatever it is that they're providing to a particular service, whether that's data or attention or whatever it is. I mean, I think it's a question that the person should answer for his or herself, right? For themselves, so I think it's a really hard thing though when we go down the path of trying to quantify what that is. I mean, but it is a concern that we hear a lot, which is that that our services are extractive, that they're basically requiring more of the person than they're returning to them in terms of value. And there are a couple of things that you can do to address those kinds of concerns. And I hope that we're doing them. One is to require less of the person, right? If the person is concerned that the services are extractive and that they're asking for too much data, right? Well, then one of the ways that we can address that is by building services that rely on less data. And I think that is where Facebook is headed. You've heard this from Mark Zuckerberg himself, that what's the future of our social services? Private communication, end-to-end encryption, right, where we don't get really much data at all, and ephemeral messaging, right? Mm-hmm. And so you're seeing us move in that direction, and I hope that starts to address what I think I hear a lot, which is a perception of an imbalance. Yeah. I mean, I also hope that people do understand that the value of our services that we provide without asking people to pay, but the fact that this is coming up a lot means that we do need to address these questions about value. And I think one of them is to work on the end of, how much are we asking from people?
Interesting. So we are the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. We define security broadly, but let's for the moment define it narrowly. There's a question that sort of points to again, the experience of users when security issues and privacy issues get mixed up together. When you have a data leak or a data breach, and I'm not going to get into an argument with you, I hope, about whether certain things are leaks or breaches, because I think from the perspective of the user, it doesn't really matter so much. It matters from the perspective of lawyers, obviously. How do you guys think about connecting those two issues together? Assuming that really strong security is a prerequisite for any reasonable privacy stance. How do you think about the investment priorities and your ROI and the attention you pay to those two dimensions of what really matters to the user in some sense, arguably in an undifferentiated way? Like privacy and security are one thing for most users.
Yeah, I think they're two sides of the same coin. And when I think about our security engineers, I mean, I don't think that they see themselves as working on something that is not privacy.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We don't make that kind of distinction. I mean, I'm thinking about our security team, which is, the foremost security engineer that I'm thinking of right now. I think probably would describe himself as a privacy engineer. I think we think of these things as two sides of the same coin, and that has to be right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think, oftentimes I think you hear privacy broken down as rules and regulations around the collection, use, and sharing of data. I think we should probably add security onto the back of that. It's probably the collection, use, sharing, and protection of data. So I don't think that we see a real line between them.
Okay, really interesting. Let's go to the question of usability, which came up in terms of like just sometimes we use the phrase cognitive load or other such phrases to describe what it actually takes for individuals to access the controls and that you talked about earlier. Sometimes, again, from outside, it seems as if they were built by engineers for engineers, with a kind of a sort of a lack of sensitivity to the basic sort of behavioral psychology of users. Sometimes, Steve, to be honest, that gets interpreted as, oh, no, they understood that perfectly well, and that's why they hit it 17 layers down in the choice hierarchy. Tell us about, your thinking about that and where you think the industry could constructively go in addressing that concern.
Yeah, it's crucial. It's absolutely crucial. I mean, because again, while I don't think transparency and control are a sufficient solution to the kinds of concerns we hear, they're definitely necessary, right? I mean, another way of looking at this is consent isn't going anywhere, right? It's the foundation of the legal regimes, at least in the in places where I spend most of my time, right? But so how do we make these things usable? We spend a lot of time on UX testing, and I mean, I think that there is a blossoming field within academia that thinks about this. We have and look, as I think I mentioned before, like academia has an outsized influence in discussions around privacy regulation, right? I mean, it's probably not the case in other areas of the law, that are sort of more established. Like we listen a lot to the scholars who are making, a big difference in this area. I mean, people like Lori Craner and Jen King and those folks. And so but I think that, there's no substitute for UX testing, which is something that we spent a lot of time doing with the Facebook activity tool that I described to you earlier. I mean, I think that that's the best answer I can give you, is that there has to be a really robust place for that.
Do you think there would be value in some sort of, and I'm not saying this needs to be necessarily led by regulators or by government, but some over time convergence towards some common industry standards, so that like we decrease some of that cognitive load by creating, recognizably similar structures, that if I'm trying to manage certain permissions around data on Google, Facebook, Twitter, Snap, wherever it may be, that they would look and feel similar? Is that just a pipe dream? Or can you imagine a future in which that might actually start to make sense?
Well, maybe. Again, this goes back to something that we were talking about earlier, right? I mean, when policymakers get into the business of designing products, the results aren't always optimal, right? I mean, policymakers are often people like me, they're lawyers. Like they're not product designers. They're not UX researchers. They're not experts. Obviously, we do what we can to help inform their discussions, with evidence. But potentially, yes. I mean, I'm the hesitation you hear in my voice comes from just that first concern, but also when you try to boil some of this stuff down, I mean it inevitably you're privileging some viewpoints over others. I can't help but think of Apple's nutrition labels, right? This is the other part of their iOS 14 update. They've essentially tried to do that, to standardize the privacy policies. But the things that they're requiring companies to talk about are things that they privilege Apple, right? They're things that they're trying to show that certain companies are engaged in practices that Apple believes it's not engaged in, and it wants to sort of create warnings for people out of these nutrition labels. And so it's really important that we have we think hard about the perspective that's reflected in whatever standardized form we're trying to create, if we do that.
Well, I can say the one thing we certainly don't want is to have the analogy of the nutrition label become a system where, in many cases, we know with nutrition labels, what is considered to be good changes every couple of years in a way that, like, it used to be polyunsaturated, and then it was saturated, and then it was trans fat that you weren't supposed to eat. So, consumers can make sense of standardized formats when they're fairly presented, but what is important to, I think, the functionality of those formats is some baseline understanding of like what is good and what is bad. And so maybe the last question I want to ask you before I ask you what's the question I should have asked you that I didn't is, where do you think sort of more sort of foundational, legitimate insight on that question is going to come from? And what I mean by that is, if in fact, we've all seen that slide with the 10,000 data brokers and how they're connected to each other. And people who don't spend all day long thinking about this really can't reasonably be expected to understand what's happening to their data when it goes out there into the world in this respect. So what do they need to know, and what can we do to actually provide that information in a more usable way? I know it's the question that is on every privacy scholar's mind, but what does it look like from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think we can do a better job explaining how it works. No question, right? And I think that we're, who can do that? I mean, I think that this is where design thinking is helpful. I think this is where sort of UX researchers are helpful. But maybe, is that the right goal? Like when I get in my car, right, and I trust that when I'm going to drive this thing down the street, that the muffler's not going to fall off, or that like the wheels aren't going to fall off. And it's not because I understand how all of this stuff works. My gosh, you should hear my stepfather talk about my knowledge of cars, right? I don't know how any of it works, but I trust it, and I trust it because it's regulated, right? I trust it because it's regulated, and I know that there are people who know the ins and outs, who are independent, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, who are NHTSA, who are independent and looking at these things, and that I can trust their independence and judgment about safety. And I mean, I think ultimately, isn't that where we want to end up when it comes to the way that privacy is protected online, where we have a situation where we are regulated comprehensively and fairly, and that we have an independent arbiter of what's fair and what's foul online. And I mean, I think maybe that's the end goal. Can we do better at explaining that Lumascape? I hope so. We're going to continue to invest in that. We're going to work with industry organizations that are trying to invest in that. We've actually done some pretty good work on explainers recently. The industry has. But I would love to see us get to the point where we just trust, we just trust. And that's gonna require a regulatory scheme, a comprehensive one.
Okay, Steve, we like to practice ending on time, so we have about one more minute. Is there a question I should have asked you expected me to ask that I didn't ask today? That doesn't mean necessarily you get to answer it, but I want to know what the question is that we should have been talking about.
I don't know, Steve. I think that when I've had these conversations, I've often heard like, well, Facebook, your concerns about all of this stuff, it sounds like you're concerned about small businesses, you're concerned about small developers. Like, what's the impact of Facebook in all of this, right? And I would say that, first of all, look, when it comes to the actual impact, you should listen to our chief financial officer. We're reporting earnings today, in fact, and you should listen to that. You should listen to Mark Zuckerberg. He recently made some comments about how, maybe the impact won't be as severe as people are suggesting, but that's not really what's going on here. What's going on here is that we fundamentally believe in the free internet as it exists, right? It's the internet that Facebook is built on. And we fundamentally believe in the value that small businesses add to the internet, right? I mean, and small businesses are the businesses that advertise on Facebook. We have 10 million plus active advertisers. The overwhelming majority of those are small businesses. So what's Facebook's stake in it? It's that. So I was surprised that I didn't hear that. I mean, maybe somebody asked in the chat, but I was surprised I didn't hear that one.
Well, listen, let's wrap up. Let me just thank you. This will obviously be an ongoing conversation. We'll be talking to you more about it. We'll be talking to lots of other folks more about it. There's nothing more important right now. And from my perspective, having it again so tangible for people is a really important inflection point. And I just hope that, like, if we're having this conversation a year from now, we will move the ball forward a little bit. And so this was part of that process, and we really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, I really enjoyed it. Thank you all so much for the opportunity, and especially to speak to folks at Berkeley who are, the scholars who are really leading a lot of these debates. It's such a valuable thing to get to speak to you all.
Rachel, over to you.
All right, thanks so much, folks. I am going to quickly share my screen now, and then we'll wrap this up here, but wanted to quickly share a couple more slides. First one is a few ways that you can get in touch with CLTC or Steve's team over at Facebook. So you can follow us on Twitter, shoot us an email, let us know your thoughts on this very important subject, what else you'd like to hear from CLTC, and definitely head to our website where you can sign up for our newsletter so that you don't miss future conversations on privacy in the future of the ad-supported internet. We're hoping that this is the first of a handful of those, as well as much more from CLTC. And if you'd like to connect with Steve or his team, we are requesting that you direct your inquiries over to Elaine Siedenberg, who is a privacy and data policy manager at Facebook. Elaine also happens to be a PhD alum from the UC Berkeley School of Information, where she's also a lecturer, and she's a former CLTC grantee. So it's great to see Elaine go from working on privacy and public policy research as a grantee and now making a real impact in the field. So I digress, but thank you, Elaine, for making yourself available for any follow-up from our audience. And finally, a quick shout out and thanks to the various CLTC supporters and individuals who help make this work and these events possible so that we can get these increasingly important issues and conversations out into the world. So I'll leave this contact slide up again once more so you can take down any of that information. Stay tuned for more about CLTC's next webinar, where we'll hopefully feature another industry participant to share on these issues. And just a huge thanks again to the audience for being here with us today. I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy and optimistic, and we will see you next time. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.